Let us dive in. Thanks for joining me tonight, Ned. For those of you who don't know, Ned Johnson, he's the president here at Prep Matters, founded the place, gosh, how many years ago, Ned?
Long time ago, 1996. We're on 25th anniversary.
Woohoo! Celebration. And I know nobody who cares more about helping kids than Ned Johnson. So you're lucky to have him here tonight.
Well, except for perhaps the MC for this evening, Dr. Aaron Golumsky, our education director, who has spent way too much time with way too many tests and pretty much everything else that the kids need to work with through high school to be successful in school and on their way to college. So Aaron, I'm happy to play color commentator and then second fiddle as you take it away.
Lovely. So the SAT versus the ACT, which test is right for you in the current testing landscape? And I should probably have edited that to say which test is right for you, if any, in the current testing landscape. So that's the topic of the evening. So let's dive right in. Yes, the SAT or the ACT. But before we dive into the differences between those two tests, and we're going to talk about all of the differences between those two tests, let's address the metaphorical element in the virtual room, and that would be the test optional movement, right? Are either of these tests right for you? So let's talk a little bit about what we've seen over the last year or two and why taking these tests may or may not still make sense for you. So who cares about scores? Why are any of us having this conversation? Well, for a great number of years, this group called NACAC, the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, went around and they surveyed all the colleges in the country, or at least here, about 220 of them, and said, hey, what do you care about? What are you interested in when you're vetting your applicants? What do you want to see from your students? What's important? And historically, year after year, the results were basically these. You'll notice that the top three that I've shaded here in green, shading mine, by the way, basically your grades. And everybody knows this. The most important determiner of where you get to apply to college and how likely you are to get in is what does your transcript look like? But the fourth one here has been historically the SAT or the ACT. And as you can see from the percentages of importance, things drop pretty rapidly after that. So for many, many years, kids obsessed over these tests because colleges told them it was important, right? So that's been the situation. And then, of course, COVID came along, and now most colleges in the country still remain test optional. But it's a really broad term, right? Test optional. Different schools do mean different things. You might have heard that some schools aren't test optional. They are, in fact, test blind. So what that means is that you can't even send your scores there. If you, for some way, try to sneak them in, they're just not even going to look at them, right? They will not consider scores in any manner or fashion when they make these admissions decisions. Notably, of course, and publicly, the University of California is going to be test blind for the foreseeable future. Catholic here in our backyard, Caltech, Reed, and a bunch of other schools are kind of running 1 to 2 year kind of little pilot programs just to collect some data and see how it works, right? On the other side of the spectrum, we've got some schools who actually didn't jump on the test optional bandwagon. The two notable state schools would be the University of Georgia and the University of Florida system. They've wanted scores this whole time. And then you've got other schools who are test optional, but if you read between the lines, they're kind of encouraging you to test. And those would be your Georgetowns, your Yales, and your Dukes of the world. But by and large, everyone who's not on one of those ends of the spectrum, they're test optional. They mean it, right? You can apply to the school with scores if you feel that's helpful, or you can apply to schools without scores if you feel that's helpful for you.
So how do we know whether it's really optional or not?
Yes, exactly. Let's talk about what actually happened.
Right.
So during this crazy year from 19 to 2021, we got a lot of more applications heading out to schools, right? An 11% increase in college applications. And most of this data that you're going to see coming at you is from the Common App, which is a great collector and aggregator of all this data. Applications surged at all of the schools whose names you recognize, right? And mostly everybody's theory on this is when you didn't need test scores, hey, let's throw an application out to that reach school and just see what happens. Lots of folks did that. So we can see places like Harvard, 42%, my goodness, like they didn't have enough applications as it was. But on the other hand, a lot of your smaller state school systems, your Cal State system, your SUNY system, those schools actually kind of took a beating a little bit when it came to applications, right?
Yeah, there was
So
data just out today, which a lot of people may have seen, about effectively 1 million fewer kids who are engaged or enrolled in college since the start of COVID. The first year of this was mostly, as Aaron points out, this state SUNY systems like SUNY. A lot of that was actually at community colleges.
yeah.
But among the most elite colleges, the sort of the top of that, most highly selective, or as Akil Bella from Fair Test would say, the most highly rejective, the number of applications surged, in part because test optional made it viable for kids who might otherwise have been dissuaded by scores that seemed, kind of off, missing the mark, but otherwise felt the grades were good enough to apply, which has added a certain amount of churn to the whole process, because it's finding that needle in the haystack, as Georgetown observed, isn't made easier by making the haystack twice as big. But in many cases, that's exactly what we're seeing.
Yeah. So what about scores? We see applications are up, but scores are in fact down. Last year, according to the Common App in this most recent cycle, about 40% of students submitted test scores. How does that compare? In a typical year, the year before, it was around 73%, and 70% is a pretty good historical number on that for the last decade or so. As you might suspect, the more selective schools had more students reporting scores. The less selective schools had less students reporting scores. And what I thought was most interesting is that fully twice as many students last year as the year before chose to send scores to some of the schools they applied to, but not others. That actually really wasn't common beforehand. People would just send their scores everywhere. They would not send scores. Now we're getting some more nuanced decisions about, I'm actually going to send scores to these schools where I think they'll help me, and I won't send these scores to schools where I don't think they'll help. So that I thought was interesting. And
it will be really interesting to see the data from this spring. And we have one independent educational consultant here on the call. Part of that top line number of only 40% of students submitted scores. Some of these are kids who, of course, are taking advantage of test optional, saying, "Gosh, I shine in every way except this SAT, and I tried hard, but the scores seem lean compared to where I am." And in many cases, there's also kids who, despite their best efforts, simply couldn't take a test. I had a kid in California who had 3 tests canceled on her, and after that, she's like, "I'm done. I'm through. I'm just applying to college. I need to turn the page and move on." And particularly in California, which is a huge chunk of the number of high school graduates and therefore college applicants. Basically, because of COVID restrictions, testing just didn't take place at all. It'll be interesting to see the numbers when the dust finally settles this spring.
Yeah, and colleges are not incredibly transparent about releasing the numbers. So just a few brave ones have. So here's what we've seen so far. So these are our 2021 admit rates for submitters versus non-submitters for the schools that actually release that information. And some of these are not full information. For example, Penn is just the ED decisions, UGA is just the EA decisions. But what we can see here largely is that the students who submitted scores generally got in at higher rates than the students who didn't submit scores. And by the way, of course, math tutor that I am, correlation does not imply causation. Obviously, the kids who chose to submit scores probably did really well in the test, and they also probably had really good grades, and were very qualified applicants in any number of ways. Of note here, in our backyard, GW actually was upside down here. They actually admitted a higher fraction of students without test scores than with test scores. So what I take home from that is that GW actually was test optional before the pandemic, right? So there are schools, your Bowdens, your GWs, who have actually been test optional and made that decision on their own before they were forced to make that decision. Those schools really, really mean it. I really don't think there's any disadvantage there for those schools who had already kind of staked the claim on the test optional territory. On the other hand, some more competitive schools, yes, they're politely declining disclosing. Yes, they are politely declining disclosing lots of information. But here, from what we can see, right, and sometimes it's, you might say to yourself, oh gosh, it's only a 5% jump, but well, if their admissions rate is 5% and you have a 10% chance with scores, that actually kind of doubled your chances, right? So it really can be a tangible thing. So I tend to think, right, that we're kind of in the same situation we've always been in. That is, good scores can give students more options and more options are generally helpful in this crazy, hard to predict process.
And I'd add really quickly, one of the people who spends a lot of time, pouring through this data and is very sort of very out front and talking about this stuff is a guy named Jeff Salingo, who was the editor of the Chronicle, a publication called The Chronicle of Higher Education. He has a book out that we will like quite a bit called Who Gets In and Why, based on his year of and is kind of an embedded reporter at 3 major universities going through their admissions cycle. Pretty darn good. He's worth following. He's very active on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, other places. We actually did an interview for our podcast here. If you want to look that up, we can include that a link thereafter. But for parents who don't understand this process, as well as they feel like they might like to, it's certainly a book that's worth a read. And again, I'll put this in the chat. It's Jeff Salingo, and the book is Who Gets In and Why.
Yes. Thank you for that. A few notes here, and I'm not sure you can read this or read it when we send around the details. Really, again, your Georgetowns and your Yales and your Dukes, if you read between the lines on what some of these admissions officers have said, right? Georgetown says we expect that most applicants should be able to fulfill the testing requirement, even though they're still technically optional, right? Yale has said that these tests are predictive of Yale performance above and beyond high school GPA. Quote from Duke that, gosh, there were students they'd really like to have had scores from last year, but they didn't. So again, you can help yourself out. Other trends to watch, though, in terms of submitting scores is that this is interesting, right? If only the kids who are getting great scores are submitting scores, what the heck is going to happen to the average scores at these schools? As you can imagine, they're going to go up, and we've seen it happen already. Average SAT, for example, at Boston College jumped from a 1413 to a 1495 in a year. That may not sound like a lot, but it's actually kind of crazy, right? University of Georgia, their 25th to 75th percentile ACT scores, 28 to 33, 31 to 34 in just a year. So when you're thinking about, should I send scores or not, and you go online and you Google and say, hey, I'm interested in I don't know, Elon University, what are their average ACT or SAT scores? Try to catch a date on that, because whether you're looking at this year's average scores or last year's average scores can actually be a pretty meaningful difference at this point. So, caveat emptor a little bit when it comes to checking out those scores these days.
And if you're wondering what, I'd love to hear from Elizabeth Roper as well, what her advice on this is, the independent counselor who's joining us here tonight. Great to see you. If the data is 2 years old, what does that mean for the most recent stuff? What do I do? And I think a solid, kind of rule of thumb, if you don't have any other one, is even if it's something from a couple years ago, aim towards the 75th percentile. I feel a little bit cautious about feeling that if you're towards the 25th percentile, that you're going to be safe there. Try to aim towards that 75th percentile. So if you looked at Georgia, a 33, which was the 75th percentile in 2019, would have had you in a pretty solid place for 2020. Not perfect, but it's one way to at least have some grounding in this.
Yeah, for sure, because scores are going to keep getting higher, and unfortunately, grades actually can't go much higher. I'm actually going to pick on UCLA here because UCLA was actually the most popular college in the country last year. They received, I think, something over 104,000 applications at UCLA. So this is what their admitted student pool looked like last year. 25th to 75th percentile. The 25th percentile weighted GPA was 4.34. That was the 25th percentile. Right, unweighted 3.92. Grades really can't get much higher. So scores still can serve as an interesting differentiator here. And for a little more historical data, I'm going to pick on UCLA again. If we look at actually the average grades the percentage of students with an average grade of an A who applied and got accepted at UCLA. Last year, clearly over 50%. But if you go back 10 years, that drops to 40%. And if you go back 10 years, 30%. And then 20, and then 15, and somewhere around 10. So we have seen this kind of grade inflation. So parents who are sitting there looking at your children's grades, the landscape of what grades look like is not exactly what it was 20 years ago. And it's just worth knowing that. So all that being said, final analysis, broad recommendations. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts of the tests, again, testing can be a helpful component, especially if you're applying to more competitive schools. However, that being said, for whatever reason, if you've got a student who's got a great transcript and everything, but this test just doesn't come together, well, it's a great time to be applying, much better than a few years ago, because you do have the option to apply test optional. And really, as we said, most students are really going to probably exercise some sort of combined strategy where they will send school scores to some schools and not to others. I suspect that actually kind of is the new normal that we're going to settle into when all the dust here clears.
And if I can add one quick thought on that, though I'm not a college counselor, what I certainly know from the college admissions process is that, and Jeff Salenko makes this case really well in his book, that students are evaluated in the context of their school. So you may see the average this, the average that, but ultimately kids are being evaluated in the context of their school. So for instance, this college might have the average kid takes, 7 APs there, but if you attend a school that has no APs, it can't be held against you that you didn't take advantage of opportunities that were not available to you. And so, a 1300 at some school might be pretty near the kind of a middling score at a super academic place. But if you're in a school that has a much lower profile, much less well resourced, you're going to be evaluated in the context of that. If you attend a school where there's not, where grades, they kind of hold a firm line on it, and there doesn't appear to be runaway grade inflation, then a 3.7 GPA may be pretty significant if the average GPA at that school is 3.6, as opposed to someplace where half of the student body has a 4.0. So again, we look at these averages for the schools and for a university, and those are important, but know that for you and for the people who are reading your application, those people are looking at your student in the context of your student's school.
Great point. Great point. So just wanted to set the table with all of that context. So now let's dive into the nitty gritty of these tests. The PSAT has already happened, right? Many of you might be here because you've got a set of PSAT scores in front of you and you're wondering what that means and how to interpret them, right? The PSAT, those scores came back in December. Whether you're happy with the PSAT scores or not so happy with the PSAT scores, the good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that your PSAT scores have gotten you 0% closer to getting into college, right? There is no way that you can transmit your PSAT scores to colleges, even if you want to, right? So it really is just practice. If it didn't work out the way you wanted to, it's fine. You've got time. Nobody needs to know about this. On the other hand, if you killed it, well, that's, a really good indicator that you're probably pretty set for the SAT, because after all, the PSAT pretty darn similar to that SAT. So let's dive into the two tests that we're here to really talk about, the SAT versus the ACT. And we'll first talk about scores because people seem to care a lot about the scores. The SAT, as many of you know, right, the good old 400 to 1600 scale that has been revisited, simply 800 on math and 800 on the incredibly pithily named evidence-based reading and writing section. And then the ACT, which may be less familiar to some of you, is scored from 1 to 36. And that composite score from 1 to 36 is a simple average of the 4 section scores, each of those to 36. So those are the scores. And as everyone probably wants to know, the question that we get asked more often than any other, well, what's a good score? Sigh. So first of all, the colleges, they really don't care, right? We often hear that as well. Well, am I handicapping my student by not taking the SAT? No, you're not. Because really there exists this concordance that just says this number on the SAT is equivalent to this number on the ACT, so that colleges consider all students on one scale, and you are really, really not advantaged or disadvantaged by choosing one test over the other. So the scores, the fancy term here is equipercentile equated, right? So that the percentiles are the same. So really you're not finding an advantage here or there. So that's
add a quick note to that for a lot of parents, particularly folks on the East Coast where you grew up with everybody took the SAT and you're like, what is this ACT thing? Like, wait, what? Because the ACT actually overtook the SAT for a while in terms of the number of students nationwide taking it. You also have at this point college admissions folks, who went through the process of college admissions, many of them taking the ACT in greater numbers than the SAT. And so the kind of prevailing East Coast bias, in favor of the SAT that really predominated for decades, really has evaporated in the last decade, and they're looked at. Actually, I used to I write. I'm sort of the test prep poster boy for the U.S. News and World Report College Guide, and for a while I was writing 7 myths about standardized tests, and one of them is good colleges want the SAT. And there's a wonderful quote from William Fitzsimmons, who's the director of admissions and financial aid at Harvard. This goes back into the early aughts, said that we accept them on an absolutely equal basis. And if it's good enough for Harvard, it's good enough for everyone else. And so even if you're a parent who grew up thinking the ACT is somehow, unseemly or not what good students take, that's at best vestigial. That's no longer the case. Take the test that's the better test for you, get the higher score if you're going to test at all.
Yeah. So the next slide, just honestly, a bit of a reality check for you, because here we sit, at least in Bethesda, Montgomery County in Northwest DC, where people are a little hyper obsessed with these scores. And I asked my students, well, what's your goal? What do you think is an okay score? What's a good score? And I'll get answers like on the SAT, I don't know, I guess maybe a 1400 is okay, but I'd really like it to be better. And that's just madness, right? Because if you look at the actual percentiles here, these tests, the average is around 1,019, right? So if you're sitting there looking at your PSAT scores and they're higher than that, great job. You've made a good start, right? You can get where you're going. So really, obviously, this is a bell curve and a normal-ish distribution. So obviously, every additional 100 points to get is a little bit harder, right? Going from a 1,000 to an 1,100 is one thing, but then getting the next 100 points to the next 100 to the next 100 kind of just ramps those percentiles up through the roof. So that, I think, a 1,400 is maybe good. Yeah, that's a 96th percentile score. Calm down, right? So take these things with a grain of salt, because really, what's a good score? I mean, a good score is a score that allows you to be in the game and apply to the schools that you'd like to go to, because this is an admissions test, and viewing it through any other lens is borderline unhealthy, right? So a good score kind of depends on you. So diving in, the SAT versus the ACT, structurally, this is kind of what they look like, right? They're each testing approximately the same things. They each have a reading section and a writing section and a math section. We'll talk about all of this in more detail. But what you probably should notice about this is, gosh, if you look at the timing, we're talking about a 3-hour plus test with hundreds of questions, right? There's an argument to be made that these are, gosh, just probably too long. Right? They certainly feel too long to the students who have to take them. I guarantee you that. So one thing that I'll say, no matter which test your child or you, for the students out there, eventually take, please make practice testing part of your preparation, right? These are 3-hour tests that, when you add in the breaks and the startup time and the filling in the bubbles and bubbling your name in, trust us, Ned and I go take these pretty much every year, and it's like a 5-hour extravaganza, soup to nuts, right? It's a long day. So success on these tests is as much about knowing the grammar rules and the equation of a circle as it is about the ability to stay cool, keep your head, remain focused, and make good decisions over the course of a 4-hour test. Sadly, I don't know of any other way to practice taking a 4-hour test other than taking 4-hour tests, right? So please practice tests on a regular basis. One of the best things you can do to make sure you are not surprised by test day.
To that, ultimately, we want to remind everyone who's on this call that the most important criterion for college success, for college admission success, is academic success in school. And so while we think of it as our job to help kids get scores that are strong as their grades are, we don't want to have them, pull down the grades and have them meet in the middle. To Aaron's point, doing full practice tests to develop that stamina is really important, but rarely do we think it's a solid idea for kids to be doing a 3-hour test every weekend, because there's a real cost to that. I mean, their happiness, their mental health, their social connections, as well as test, their academic performance. A full test, yes, so you have that stamina, but if kids are doing work on a weekly basis, we are often, suggesting do a half a test, do a section, do it times so you have that experience, a little bit of oomph. But one can certainly do part of a practice test this weekend, the other part the following weekend, because doing 3 hours of test week after week feels more like torture than tutoring.
Right. And then I don't know that I've ever met a student who's able to really take that seriously every week. And eventually you end up, practicing blowing off the SAT. Right. And we want to practice like play. So practicing not taking it seriously is not exactly the best move. So let's dive into the details and see how some of these compare against each other. But before that, the one salient difference, probably the biggest difference between these tests, is time. Right. Most of us who do this professionally will agree that the hardest stuff on the SAT is probably harder than the hardest stuff on the ACT, largely because it's tricky. It's messing with you a little bit. Right. And most students, when they take an ACT for the first time, are like, oh my goodness, that was way more straightforward. That felt more like school. I liked it so much better. But I couldn't finish. I really wish I had more time. Right. So that is manifestly the biggest difference between the tests at this point. Right. The SAT, more complex, more nuanced, a little more reading between the lines, a little more problem solving, but you have a lot more time to do it. The ACT, more direct. If you know what you're doing on an ACT problem, you know what you're doing. They're not messing with you, but you've got to execute, and you've got to be able to execute quickly and accurately. Which test is harder? Well, that kind of depends on how your brain's wired. We've seen students who are really good at one, but not the other. We've seen students who just, no matter, great students, incredible students, no matter what they do, however, they just can't hang with the speed of the ACT. That they're capable of unpacking all the nuance on the SAT and doing great. And we've seen students who, maybe struggle with the nuance, but gosh, they can work quickly and efficiently when they know what to do. So you want to think about your student and what their particular strengths are. And this is probably the first decision point that we've got in terms of which test might be right. So I'm going to start with the reading section because honestly, it tends to be, for me at least, probably the most important section that I look at when I'm trying to make the decision for a student in front of me. Do we go with the SAT or do we go with the ACT? Because these are really, they're the same in that, hey, here's a reading passage. It's around 100 lines. And now we're going to ask you 10 questions about what was in that passage. But oh my goodness, they feel very different. Right. So, in terms of timing, right, the passages, like I said, same length on each test, same number of questions. On the ACT, you got about 8.5 minutes to do it. On the SAT, you've got 13, like literally 50% extra time on the SAT. And you need it. Right. So I'm just throwing some cartoons here at you, but very much the ACT is a little more surface level test. Right. It's more concrete. It's like the world's worst game of Where's Waldo. Right. You ask me a question, the answers are in there. Guarantee it. You just have to find them. Right. And Waldo was hiding more than your 5-year-old self would have liked. And, here, these answers are sometimes hiding more than your 15 or 16-year-old self would like, but they're always there. On the other hand, SAT is a little more Sherlock Holmes, a little more finding the clues and following the breadcrumbs to get to the right answers, which are certainly there. They're just hidden a little more. Right. Also, vocabulary, right? No longer, vocabulary, I would say, is no longer tested discretely, but it's tested discreetly, right? What I mean by that is of course, there are no sentence completions or analogies or antonyms or any questions like that. But certainly the SAT passages employ a higher level of diction, a lot more fancy vocabulary words in the SAT than you would ever find on the ACT. An analogy that will likely land for parents and students, sorry, you're not going to get this, the SAT is to the journal as the ACT is to the USA Today. But again, big difference in speed as well. Anything to add to the reading there, Ned?
Well, we'll talk about this probably towards the end, but it really is that tension between precision, time and the kind of ease of it. So almost always with students who have accommodations for extra time, particularly if they're language-based learning disabilities, where they just have a little bit harder time with verbal material. Generally, the ACT comes down as the better test, because absent that, with absent that time pressure, if it really is a matter of being tenacious and digging up the answers, even kids where reading isn't their greatest strength can really perform or kind of outperform on the ACT. When it comes to, and we'll talk about this later as well, because these tests can engender a certain measure of stress for folks, and when we have stress, our prefrontal cortex flows with too many neurotransmitters, and then we don't think as clearly, it really can become an issue of which test, even if you do struggle with time, does that feel like something that with practice you can get better at, even though you had enough time, but you thought the reading comprehension was hard on the SAT? Can you, with practice, wrap your head around what they're really asking you there? A big part of this is not just, the particular practice test is not a litmus test. It's not a blood test. One score doesn't really tell us which test is the better one, because it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. We kind of know where we are, but we also want to get a sense of, I'm here, but I want to be there. Which of these is easier for me to overcome? Better strategies in terms of time management, learning how to read more closely the way that the SAT wants me to. So it's a process, not a single test, I would say.
Oh gosh, yes. So the next section, I think probably the second most important one to me, at least, would be the math section. And reading and math, probably no surprise. So the differences here, really, I've tried to encapsulate in incredibly unscientific bar graphs. I just kind of eyeballed these, so heads up. But I think the story here is relatively accurate. That is, the ACT is far more broad in terms of content. The ACT math section I actually really like. It's kind of like a multiple choice final exam where everything from 4 years of high school math, from algebra 1, geometry, algebra 2, up to pre-calculus, it's all fair game, right? So, it's kind of nice in that way. The SAT, on the other hand, is really a test of algebra. There's very little geometry there and far less pre-calculus than you'll find on the ACT. So while the SAT questions might be wordy and tricky and somewhat confusingly written, the actual kind of academic tools required to solve them, it's really not that many. Right, kids are always surprised by how often, like, their 8th grade tools, right, will serve them well on the SAT and the ACT, and it's really very much true. So, if you're a student who maybe loved geometry, the ACT might be a better fit. If you hated ACT might be a better fit. If you hated geometry, hey, you might want to check out the SAT. This also kind of one thing that impacts this is what math class you're taking now, right? For students who already have completed pre-calculus or are about to complete pre-calculus, the ACT becomes far more accessible, right? Students who maybe aren't on that math track and are still taking algebra 2, going to be a little more difficult to wrestle with a lot of the more complicated or advanced material at the end of that ACT.
I would also add to that, there was a trend for probably a better part of a decade where there was this sort of acceleration where high school juniors were taking the test earlier and earlier, rather than, traditional dates of May or March. It was the January SAT before they got rid of that. Even December, November, October, kind of faster, earlier, in part because the math content on the SAT really was geometry and algebra 1, and it's smattering of algebra 2, not that deep. When the SAT was redone in 2016, it really pivoted towards being more like the ACT with kind of more content, certainly much more of algebra 2, tiny bit of pre-calculus. So it really wasn't credible. It's for many kids, it's not credible to take the SAT early in their junior year until they've had more of junior math under their belts. ACT, kind of Coke versus Pepsi, SPY versus SPY, reciprocated by, in the last 4 years, really turning up the sophistication of esoteric math content that is on there. So the same kind of thing there, that the rush to try to take these tests early in junior year, unless you're on an advanced math track, isn't such a hot idea. Because while Aaron and I love geeking out on math and teaching kids things that they haven't learned yet, that's really not the best use of their time or your money, better to let kids let the hard work that they're doing in school do that heavy lifting of getting the content in their heads, and then let Aaron or me or someone like us or Khan Academy, whatever you're doing, help show how to take that content and how it applies to tests and get more sophisticated with it, rather than having starting tabula rasa with I don't know this stuff at all. When 3 months from now you're gonna spend 10 days doing this in school, and then this stuff will feel really easy to you because it'll be really familiar to you.
Yeah. Absolutely. The other thing I want to mention is that the ACT allows you to use your calculator on the entirety of the math section. The SAT, on the other hand, has 2 math sections, one with calculator and one without. That without calculator section tends to make some students nervous, but I'm here to say this. The no calculator section, it's kind of, I don't know, it's aimed more at Ned and at me than it is at students in a sense, right? Because there are lots of little test preppy ways to get around doing the algebra. We can pick numbers, we can test answers, right? And this is not Ned's secret sauce or mine. Open a Kaplan book and they'll tell you the same thing, right? So the no calculator section is essentially, if they were being a little more honest about it, they'd probably call it not so much the no calculator section, but the algebra section, right? They're just trying to force students to have to do the algebra. So there's not a lot of computation, right? You're not going to be tested on long division or 2-column multiplication. That's not what this is about. It's about making you do the algebra. That being said, there are certainly some students who even so get a little nervous when they don't have that TI 83 attached to their wrist. So something to note.
And I'd say really quickly, just for me, the kind of trickiness on the math. One of the things that the SAT did when its latest iteration of the new SAT was really lean in on the research of the standards in the Common Core. And so a lot of that tricky math is presenting content that kids ostensibly know, but in ways that are unfamiliar. So rather than equation y equals mx plus b, a kind of a straightforward linear equation, they'll gum it up in kind of a wordy word problem, and kids can feel like, wow. And so a lot of times kids can feel overwhelmed and feel like this is, unknown or unknowable, when it's really, kind of decoding what they're seeing and realizing this is language that they know, but presented in ways that are unfamiliar. So back to, spending time with your mom, with your dad, with your tutor, with your math teacher, with Khan Academy, with someone like us. This stuff is, if kids have there are a lot of kids who have very strong math foundations who really do underperform on the SAT because they just don't like that curveball. But with a little bit of experience, they can realize this isn't as novel as it seems. This actually is stuff that I know. But this is oftentimes a source of underperformance the first time kids take a PSAT or an SAT. It doesn't mean, and for those of you who may have kids who thought, but I thought it was so much more academic than this, you are really academic. It's just you want to spend a little more time and figure out just what these rascals are up to.
Yeah. The last section they have in common, the ACT calls it in English, the SAT calls it a writing, but really they're basically both overgrown grammar tests, right? And this section actually tells folks like us the least about which test to take for 2 reasons. One, they're basically the same section. This is the section where really similar between the 2 tests. And 2, it's probably, for my money, the easiest section to improve. Right? Why? Because it's the most consistent, right? I mean, people rail against standardized tests and how terrible they are. And even if we accept the premise that they're bad tests, if anything, they have one saving grace, and that they're consistently bad, right? They're bad in the same way every single time. And that's why preparation helps. In the case of the English and writing sections, they're kind of very emblematic of that, in that they are so consistent from test to test, right? Really, there are a myriad of math problems that they can throw on you on the SAT or the ACT, but for whatever reason, honestly, we're talking about maybe 2 or 3 handfuls of grammar rules that get tested over and over and over and over again. So more than any other section, this one is really quite susceptible to just drilling it and killing it. So, when we're looking at scores, I'm always just delighted when I have a practice test in front of me. The English test or the writing score is the lowest. Great, slam dunk. We know that we can push that one up generally way more easily than others.
Mm-hmm. There's a local independent school that I like to give a hard time, where it's a terrific place. But kids come in and Aaron, to your point, often kind of really kind of scores that seem a little off the mark for the English or the writing. And as I always observe to them, your school, let's be honest, doesn't really do a particularly good job teaching you punctuation or grammar, but I mean, if we're fair, they don't really do a bad job either. They just don't bother at all, because for most kids, if they're given sort of, intense instruction on that, it's often done in 7th grade, and then everyone reverts to their habits, good or bad, that they had before. And it really doesn't get revisited that much, because once kids are rolling into high school, it's so much more about reading and literary analysis and what they're writing. And rare is the modern teacher who is kind of just, maniacal about going at every misplaced comma or comma splice or what have you, kind of crazy with a red pen. And so kids are just a little bit sloppy because they're doing it by instinct. They're doing it by kind of inconsistent feedback. And as Aaron said, because these tests are standardized, we may not like them, but in all the ways that they may stink, they at least stink in consistent ways. And so I had a kid who first time he took the ECT got a 21 on the ECT English, and moved it up to 31 by just, okay, those are the rules in study, and kind of looking at game tape on a week by week basis, which is in addition to hard work, that reflection is really valuable because you learn the patterns. And if you learn the patterns, then you get better and better week by week.
And I mean, I always enjoy talking about the grammar one because I'm a grammar dork. And two, right, it's actually something I can do that's tangible that I think helps students, right? Whether students are able to like apply the substitution method to solve an SAT math problem, not going to be a big deal in their lives in 5 years, right? On the other hand, better punctuation, better grammar, it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. So I always, special place in my heart for the writing sections on these tests. Finally, we'll do this, right? The ACT still has an optional essay. Please don't sign up for it, right? The SAT no longer has an essay. The reason that the ACT still has an optional essay is basically that there are plenty of states, typically in the Midwest, that use the ACT as an exit exam, right? As their kind of high school graduation requirement. And some of those states insist that there's an essay, which is pretty much the only reason the ACT hasn't tossed it yet. There are no colleges that want the essay. They really don't care. Please don't bother with it. It's a waste of your money and your students' time at this point. So that's already more words than the essays deserve, so I will move on. The last section to talk about is on the ACT. It has a science section, and that has no counterpart on the SAT. And I've spent some time, as has Ned, saying that the ACT is the more straightforward test. It's the more honest test. Well, perhaps the least straightforward and honest thing the ACT has ever done is to call this a science section. It's not, right? If they were being a little more honest, they call it the reading charts and graphs section, because I like to compare it, if anything, to the reading section of the test, right? The reading section of these tests, they don't ask you, about the classics. They don't ask you questions about The Great Gatsby and The Grapes of Wrath and all those books you were supposed to have read by now, because they can't. It's a standardized test. Instead, here's a passage, kid, go read it and now answer the questions, and all the answers are in the text, of course, because that's the only fair way to do it. In the same way, different schools have different science curricula. Some schools start with biology in freshman year, others physics in freshman year. They don't know who's taken what, so they take the same tack. Hey kid, here's a passage. In this case, typically, here's an experiment that was done. Now answer some questions, and all of the answers to the questions are in the passage, but now instead of in 90 lines of text, generally in figures and charts and tables and graphs. So students who might be a little science phobic should not avoid the ACT because it has a science section. Similarly, students who love science are often disappointed when they get to the ACT science section because they aren't using a heck of a lot of science knowledge to answer questions. Of course, knowing a lot about science makes it easier to contextualize the information in these passages and get through it more quickly, which is always valuable on the ACT. But really, it is not a test of your science knowledge. And if anything, for me, it correlates a little more with processing speed and actually the reading score than it does with the math, which tends to be a surprise to people who tend to think of science and math and just kind of putting those STEM classes all together in their minds.
You know, and Elizabeth has a great point that she sees students who are visually oriented who can do really well on this, sometimes even when they're not doing well in the reading. And I think that's fair. Kind of the best way for all the, parents on the call to understand this is if you were on a website looking for something, dime to a dollar, your kids would find that more quickly than you would, because as digital natives, they just scan for information more quickly. And a lot of what goes on the SAT, ACT science is not reading deeply, not really pulling it apart like it's a school lab report. It's much more about finding the relevant information, being precise, answer the question, move on. The other thing that I would say really quickly is that we proctor these practice tests to school systems to help kids and parents make an informed decision about one test versus the other. And one of the things that will often happen is there's an independent girls' school here in the area we work with, and they're really academic kids and really on average really good at tests, at these standardized tests, and it's something like the average English score is here and the math is here and the reading, and then the science is ka-chink, because the first time they take the science, they don't know what they're getting into. And like anything that's novel, right, you kind of tentatively explore it and they're kind of figuring this thing out. And they're just burning time by trying to be careful and precise and really comprehending things in ways that really aren't rewarded. And they're, 98% accurate on 2/3 of the test, and then and the thing falls apart. So if you have a student who takes a diagnostic ACT at school, at home, what have you, and everything is great except for the science, don't let them run away from the ACT simply because that science was traumatic. Sadly, because the science is the last section and the last thing that kind of in the flavor in their mouth, they're like, that was terrible, because that unpleasant ending kind of can color the whole thing. Have them spend a little time, work through them, get a practice test, get the book or whatever, and explore whether that was true or just a bad first experience. Because a lot of times with some practice, some understanding, a little bit of strategy, kids can really improve how they do on the science, particularly if they already have those visual discernment skills or, strong reading skills, or as someone asked before, if they have extra time on the ACT, then it's just a matter of using that time well and getting comfortable with what at first seems kind of unfamiliar and a little uncomfortable on the science.
Yeah, for sure. When I see a high reading and math score and a low science score, in my head, I literally just immediately add 4 or 5 points, because I know that I'll be able to do that with a kid in literally 2 weeks. But I think I kind of jumped ahead to this slide because Ned's making great points about diagnostic testing, right? In the final analysis, we're going to give you all sorts of stereotypes and broad brushstrokes here. In the final analysis, the best way to know is to have your kid take a practice SAT and a practice ACT, and then you'll be able to compare. That being said, there are a few caveats, right? That practice ACT, usually gets the short end of the stick. One, because of all of those things that I just mentioned about the science section. And also, it also is just a little more unfamiliar, right? Kids have all taken the PSAT, sometimes twice already, right? So they kind of know what to expect when they dive into the SAT, because it's basically the PSAT again. So those kids, if they start taking an ACT in the same way, by the way, at the same pace, they're going to get rocked on time on not just the science section, but on most of the sections, right? So if you see kids who just ran criminally short on time, oftentimes just taking the test again, literally the next day, they'd be better because they just didn't know they had to go that fast, right? So there are ways for kind of students to underperform on the ACT relative to the SAT. So certainly take a practice test of each, but we want to do a little more than just look at the top line scores and equate them to try to find out what the path of least resistance is, because after all, if the kid's going to be doing some heavy lifting and practicing here, it's worth spending a little time to do a full investigation and make sure we're barking up the right tree. Some other factors just to mention that differentiate the test actually sometimes have nothing to do with the content of the tests, right? In terms of the SAT and ACT, one policy that's different is how you cancel scores. Right. And this functionally, now that we're kind of in the everybody's test optional era, I think this is more psychologically important than it is practically important. But students just love knowing that on the ACT, after you get your score report back, you can delete score reports you don't like. But yep, that didn't go well. I'm gonna write ACT a letter. You actually have to write them a letter. I'm gonna write ACT a letter, and I'm gonna cause that score to exist or not exist. It's gone. No one will ever see it. It is no longer existing. Can't really do that on the SAT. On the SAT, you know, if you have an awful day, you show up, you puke on your shoes, you're pretty sure it wasn't your best day. Yeah, you can sign a little piece of paper right there that says, please don't grade this. I don't want to know. But then it never gets graded, right? But the ACT, you can take it as many times as you want, get as many scores as you want, and then delete them all except the one you like. So practically, when you're submitting scores these days based on the test date, it kind of ends up being the same thing, but students just like that policy on the ACT, and it can lower the pressure a little bit, having them know that if it doesn't go my way, that's fine, I'll just delete the score. So that's a nice thing to know. When it comes to accommodations, Ned also kind of hinted already that the ACT tends to be a better test for most kids who are able to secure accommodations, and that's true. The ACT just has a much wider suite of potential accommodations, including multi-day testing, which is really great. So for students who are able to qualify for certain accommodations in that way, the ACT can be a little more helpful. I also tend to like the calendar on the ACT a little better, right? The SAT, there's the May test, which is literally right in the middle of, you know, the AP. You might remember AP season, it's 2 weeks in May. Yeah, the May SAT is right in the middle of that because that's a great idea. You know, so also the SAT in June, first week in June, when most students are kind of cramming for final exams, right? So the spring calendar on the ACT tends to just be a little more forgiving in terms of those things. Here, there's a big red X. The ACT has a plan. It will affect nobody on this call, but if you hear about it, you should know about it. A plan to have students be able to retake just one section at a time. Hey, I took the ACT, did great. Would really like to have a better math score. Let me just retake the math section. Yeah, they're working on rolling that out. So if you hear something about it, don't be surprised. It is not going to be rolled out in time to affect anybody listening to this talk, unless you've got like a 8th grader waiting in the wings or something. But if you're a sophomore or junior now, probably not going to apply to you, but just heads up, it's coming down the pipe for any younger siblings out there. So then, you know, of course, everyone says, well, which would you recommend, Aaron? And if you will forgive us for stereotyping broadly and painting with a very wide brush, you know, here are some stereotypical students who tend to overperform on one test or underperform on the other, right? Your classic smart slacker tends to overperform on the SAT relative to the ACT, right? The I'm going to look for the angle kid. Aha, I got you. You're not going to fool me. You know, those kids just tend to be wired in a way where they almost enjoy the problem solving aspect and outsmarting the SAT. Right. On the other hand, your color-coded binder, you know, nose to the grindstone, hardworking, very academic, straight A students, yeah, those kids tend to perform really well on the ACT because it's a more straightforward academic test and it just plays to their strengths, right? You know, obviously fast versus deep is a big deal. I threw in this last one, quizzes every day versus I'll rock the final exam. You know, yeah, kids who just like tests, right? Oh yeah, they never turned in all their homework, but that's fine. I'll just do well on the final and that'll bring my score back up. Yeah, those are SAT kids for sure. You know, people who are made nervous by the final exam, they tend to, I think, be ACT kids in my mind. Other useful stereotypes that you like there, Ned?
I think I said it really well, and part of this has to do with really just how different brains work. Some people perform better with more stress. Some people perform better with less stress. The SAT, because it's a little bit more tricky, is a little bit more demanding of working memory. Really, that ability to think, to be clever under pressure, and the SAT does a little bit better job of creating that. And so the kind of bright slacker are kids who they don't feel enough activation. They really just kind of can't be bothered doing the day in day grind of, like, I don't know, actually handing in that homework. And then the higher pressure they feel under the SAT, they dial in and they focus really well. Kids who work, you know, very well, they don't need anyone telling them what to do. They don't need pressure. And in fact, they don't do as well under pressure, oftentimes find the ACT to be the better test for them. Oh yeah, thanks for bringing this up. This is something called the Yerkes-Dodson law. very famous performance curve. You see performance low to high on the y-axis, the up and down axis, for those of you who haven't done math in a while. Across the bottom, stress, which could also be measured more properly. Physiological arousal, which really just means how much cortisol, how much adrenaline, how much norepinephrine is sort of coursing through you. When there's no pressure, typically performance isn't so hot. We all need a certain amount of oomph, right? A little bit of pressure before a soccer game, a little bit of pressure before talking to somebody who thinks is cute, a little bit of pressure before taking a math test or public speaking. Helps us focus, helps us perform. There's a huge body of literature on this. The problem is it's not linear. That is, the pressure gets higher and higher. At some point, the performance falls apart. And importantly, this curve is highly individualized. There's some people who are way more to the left. A little bit of pressure is all they need, and too much, things fall apart. They're the people much more to the right. They need a bunch of pressure. They say, I perform best under pressure. And if they're really honest with themselves, it's not that they perform best under pressure. It's that they only perform under pressure. And so this is why they're really important individual differences. What may be good for you and works great for your brain just may not be where your kid is. And so you're trying to help them explore those differences, paying attention to what goes well and what's a challenge in school, and taking those insights and those lessons as we apply them to standardized tests, if that's going to be part of what your kids do.
Yeah. And it's also highly contextual, right? I've heard any number of times from parents who are like, I don't understand why this test bothers him. He's, able to go up and, perform in front of 8,000 people, and he's not nervous at all. Why does this make him nervous? Well, because it's a very different thing, right? So, so different kids have different triggers. So, very contextual as well. So let's talk about one black and white thing. As we said, hey, if you got accommodations, please start by checking out the ACT. It is very likely that's going to be the better test for you. Ned and I have been, combined long time doing this, I will say. I can maybe think of on one hand the number of kids in the last 15 or so years who were able to get accommodations on both tests and for whom the SAT was actually a better test for them. Not saying never, but it's kind of a unicorn.
Yeah.
And then finally, let's talk about just a moment about scheduling, and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah. So this is basically all the test dates, right? So it's, more or less every 6 weeks throughout the year. There used to be a January SAT, that got zapped. The big change in the last couple of years is there are now summer tests. There's in addition to a June ACT, there's a July one, there's an August SAT, which really means that you can take the test pretty much any time of year. And what you really want to do is think about, when can my kid take the test, do the practice that they want to do? When can they take this when they don't feel something else that's really stressful, really competing with their time and attention? Because though these tests can be important, we don't want to put too much effort into this if it's in the middle of, wrestling practice, when we don't eat for the next 6 weeks, or when a big term paper is coming, or the school musical is going up and you're really sleep deprived. We want to take these tests when we can feel well prepared and be able to do it in a way that feels balanced given everything else that's going on.
And one, let me just dispel one urban legend I hear far too often. I'll hear things from kids like, well, I'm going to take the test I'm going to wait till the fall, because in the fall, right, all the seniors who didn't do well the first time are going to take the test again, and they're not very good at this. So then the curve will be better. That's not actually how this works. That's not how it's graded. All of that is taken into account before the tests are ever given. So there is no test date that is historically easier or harder, but they're just, as Ned said, maybe ones that because of your schedule may be easier or harder for you. So, and
a quick word on that too is, again, I made mention before that there have been this sort of process of acceleration of when kids are taking the test, and it can be stressful for you or for your kid if it feels like everybody else is already taking the test, as though they've gotten all the good, the 33s, 34s, 35s. There won't be any left for me. And of course, we know that's silly, but it can very much feel that other kids are, they're rushing ahead and somehow I'm behind. And ultimately, we would like to really advocate that folks try to if they're going to take this test, try to get a good score by the end of junior year, in part because at that point, the sort of the things have really been written in terms of what your most of your high school grades are. And with that, you can have a sense of what kind of schools are appropriate to be looking at, and then what scores we need. So it's much easier to go shopping for colleges if you know that I've got a 3.8 GPA and my SAT is a 1350 or 1450 or whatever it happens to be. If you have these great, if you have really strong grades, but you think, well, if I have these scores, I can go look at this group. If I have these scores, I can look at another. Waiting to do that until the fall of senior year makes it hard to kind of go shopping when you're looking at colleges. Absolutely, students can plan to take or retake the SAT or ACT over the summer after junior year or this fall of their senior year. It's just, we wouldn't have that be the first time you take that, certainly not by design. If that's what happens because your kid catches mono or something else pops up, we understand. But if you're thinking that we're going to be able to do pretty well on these tests, we would aim towards getting at least one pretty good, if not the ultimate score, SAT or ACT by the end of junior year. So when you're talking with your school counselor or your independent counselor, they have the data to help sort of guide you on kind of what schools you can be looking at, and you decrease the unpredictability of the process.
And speaking of independent counselors, Katie Dunn, our own Director of Educational Planning, just a shout out here. Next week, an hour earlier, next Thursday evening, we have a webinar on high school course selection. You all are welcome to go if you've got questions about, how many APs are enough? How many are too many? Do I take the AP or not? Do I, take Enviro or Chem 2 next year? She's there to answer all your questions. So feel free to stop on by. And with that, we'll thank you very much for your time and attendance. And Ned and I are happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that you might have for us.
Yeah, there are a couple. Do you see that, Aaron? I think you were following a little bit more closely the guidance from College Board about the digital formats of the test. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we frankly don't know about that? But there's not a lot to share there. But
yeah, not a whole lot. There's going to be another larger announcement, and let me just do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
David Coleman at the College Board is set to make an announcement later in the month about what the future holds. It is surmise that he will be making an announcement about rolling out a digital SAT. I think for a while, we'll probably have the option of doing both. A lot of the digital tests, for those who don't know, are actually really being piloted internationally. For example, the ACT internationally is almost completely online at this point. So those things are coming. They will be here. Will there be a digital option in time for your junior? Probably not. Your sophomore? I don't know. We'll know later this month.
And I'd say that College Board especially has really been at wanting to have a digital version of the SAT for at least a decade. And they've gotten a lot of pushback for concerns about equity and access. During COVID, a lot of other tests moved online. The SSAT moved online. The ISEE moved online. The MCAT that was already made that move. The LSAT, so both high school placement tests and graduate school admissions tests moved online. And I think that the digital version either delivered in a testing center or from testing at home. And I think this has created perhaps some political cover for College Board and ACT to move ahead. And to the degree that their argument might be we're responding to consumer needs, gosh, through all these kids, that gap between 40% this past year and 73% the year before, who really might have liked to take a test if they were a place to take the test, or they could do it without putting their life in peril. Thank you, COVID. We're just responding to those consumer demands. So I think that this will be part of the future. My suspicion is that for a long, long while, we won't become only digital. It'll be an option between paper and digital. And I imagine that if I had to guess, you'll probably be seeing this beta tested here within the States in the next year. The question about, sorry. Oh, yeah, go ahead. All you.
Question that just came in: is there any harm or risk to taking the SAT multiple times? Are there schools that make you report all scores, or can you choose which to send? By and large, you are under control and can choose which to send. Right? Back when we took the test, when I sent my SAT scores off, every single thing I'd ever done with the College Board and the achievement tests and every SAT went out one happy package with one nice bow on it. That is no longer how it is. You can send scores by test date. Send the December test, don't send the April test, send the May test, don't send the June test. You're in control of that. Pre-COVID, there were literally 2 handfuls of schools in the country that actually, as part of their common application, said, hey, please list every time you've taken the SAT or ACT, and please send us all the scores. Thank you very much. I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't think they're doing that in the new score optional era. Do you know of any schools who are actually enforcing that at this point, Ned?
Yeah, I'm going to let for a couple of our counselors who are going to help us out with this. Pre-COVID, I Stanford asked for everything, Notre Dame asked for everything, Yale. It's a little bit of a challenge because it's a little bit of a moving targets, because if they're test optional, then how do you require everything? But it's a solid idea, particularly if you anticipate that your kid is going to be applying to the most highly selective colleges, and there's a dream school, it's your your mom's alma mater, what have you, to just go and look and see what it is, and just Google report all scores, Stanford or whatever, and see what it happens to be. A quick caveat on that is, even if a school does ask you to report everything, it's not a problem, but it's not a problem if you underperform a little bit. What one simply does not want to do is go and take out an official SAT or an official ACT, especially SAT, and just see how it goes. There's so many opportunities to take practice tests, no matter where you live. Anyone can come and take a practice test at our shop, whether they work with us or not, across the country. Khan Academy, there are options. In part because, we don't want kids to go in there and have that be a dispiriting experience. We always want to be building momentum for future success. So if a kid is, thinks she's going to get a 1500 and she gets a 1420, she's allowed to be bummed, but that's not a crisis. But what we don't want to do is roll in there thinking I'd like to get a 1500, never having taken a single practice test, and then be surprised by 1300 or something. You want to go in there with a sense of where you're likely to perform or where you want to perform. And if you fall short of it, totally fine. You regroup, take it again, have a better day. But don't go in there just to see how it goes, because if it turns out that down the line that your dream school actually says, send us everything, we would rather avoid having data there that we don't want to have there. If it happens, and it is what it is, but don't sort of just blithely take an official test as a practice test. Let practice be practice, and let the real thing be the real thing.
Yeah, and on that same note, when you take an official test, when you register, there'll be an opportunity. Hey, would you like to send these scores to 4 colleges for absolute free? Just write down the names of the colleges right now. Yeah, please don't do that. Right, again, to Ned's point, let's get all the data before we go sending scores. And then one small thing to add to that, there's something called super scoring. So when you're comparing yourself to the numbers that you'll see on websites about 50th to 75th percentile scores, realize that colleges are trying to paint the best picture of their new incoming freshman class. So generally, what they're going to do is, if you send them 2 sets of scores, let's say you rocked the math in December and then crushed the reading in March, they're going to actually kind of add those 2 highest section scores together and consider your application with that super scored number, not so much because they're trying to be nice to you, but because they want to make themselves look better and publish a higher average set of scores. Mm-hmm. So just realize the scores that you're looking at when you're looking at published numbers are actually super scores. Colleges do in fact see everything, but they generally are publishing the super scored number. Mm-hmm.
A real quick follow-up question Kristen asked, is it true for the ACT since they allow you to cancel scores? There's certainly no risk there. The potential risk with the SAT does not exist with the ACT, since you can delete the scores. That being said, I wouldn't, as a parent of 2 teenagers, I wouldn't send my kid in to take an actual anything just as practice. 1, because I don't want to deal with the experience of it, and 2, there's that COVID thing that's still kicking around. So let's find another way to do that. I put in the link really quickly. We have on our website tools where they're basically proctoring videos. And so our colleague James gets on there. Hi, I'm James, and kind of runs through a 3-hour video, or 4.5 if it's extra time. There's a link there where you can download a PDF. You can take a test. You can upload the data. You can send it to us. We'll grade the test for you. And so we want to help every kid be well prepared. To Elizabeth's question about, can you talk about a good practice test experience? Well, Just like you'd want to do well on a big game day or a math final exam, you would want to do a practice test as well as you can, where you do a little bit of review, or at least you familiarize yourself with the content. You get a good night's sleep. You get up, you do something that warms you up, and listen to favorite music. You have your best bagel, put on your lucky shirt, whatever, because we want to, in many ways, simply build confidence, build positive experiences, but also eliminate variables. For Aaron and for me, a lot of it's like, well, this seems surprising that you performed here. It seems like, gosh, you were anticipating higher scores, and that makes sense to me too. And then we're trying to peel away and try to figure out, was it this? Was there distraction? Was that, your little brother was yelling down the hall? Did you stay up tonight? Was your phone blowing up with text? Blah, 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 blah. The more that we can have any practice test be kind of rigorously controlled, and as Aaron said before, you practice like you play, then we are eliminating those variables, where it makes it easier to apply the scientific process to figure out, okay, we still have this gap. What could that be? And we've already crossed things off the list that might have been potential sources of disruption.
Yeah, and it's not that I think your kid's going to cheat. I don't. But like, not intentionally at least, but there's this little like micro cheating. There's, yeah, okay. I'm not going to cheat, but like, I have to use the bathroom, and it's between the English and the math section. So I'm just going to go use the bathroom, and then, I'm going to talk to my brother, and then and before you know it, it's like, I've given myself a nice 20-minute break between sections. Cool. Or, the timer went off. I just need another 30 seconds. That's fine. Right. And those things obviously don't happen on the real test day. And I know for me, at least as a tutor, right, during this whole kind of virtual learning extravaganza, I think we've gotten pretty decent at delivering, SAT tutoring online. But for me, the biggest impact was that, kids couldn't actually take real practice tests, like in uncomfortable chairs, in a room full of their sweaty colleagues, right? And really dedicate the time to it. I think for me, it definitely led to some more unpredictability in scores and some more surprises for me, at least as a tutor in the last year or so. And I think that really was the missing piece. So I'm a big believer in actually getting in the physical space and doing it if you can do that safely.
Yeah, and the only caveat that I would say to that is, if you have a kid who is at best lukewarm about doing a practice test, don't fight over all the conditions, because in psychology, in negotiation, they say you can pick your price or pick your terms. And if the kid is begrudgingly taking a test, and then you start insisting on all the ways, all the best practices that make sense, that we on this call know make sense, but they're the things that just drive your kid nuts, then you're going to really wipe out their motivation, and they're just going to go through the motions. At some point, I'll have to share. I have a colleague, our mutual colleague, a kid who came in to take a practice test. Apparently wasn't her idea. And she was taking an SAT with extra time, sat there for 4.5 hours, and literally filled in like A, B, C, D, A, B, and then made little pictures. It was very artistic. It was very well done. But it was probably about 25 minutes of screwing around that she did over the course of 4.5 hours. It's like, you can drag me to the prep matters and do this, but you can't make me care. And so ultimately, because we want kids to take it seriously, but we also want them to engage fully. Just pick your battle when it comes to those things. You can you make all the recommendations you have, but ultimately say it'll be your call. You're much likely to get buy-in, excuse me. And the last question I saw on there was about how many hours of practice, if you were going to do tutoring, how many hours are necessary? Well, again, enormous individual differences. In our experience, I think when we run the numbers right, Aaron, like the average person who works with us is in the neighborhood of 11 or 12 sessions. There are certainly folks who both of us have worked with who have done this for what feels like forever, right? And they may have started with very low expectations and very high and very low scores and very high expectations. And it takes longer, to go from a 23 to a 33 than it does to go from a 31 to a 33. A big part of this is trying to assess, manage expectations, set goals that feel achievable, but also trying to figure out where are we and where do we want to be. And just like I said before, the scientific method, kind of what are the apparent causes of underachievement? Because sometimes, you and I both had kids who turn around in less than a month and bam, and there's that missing piece. Other kids, it's much more about content. I would say that effective test preparation kind of has three parts. One, it's content. You kind of got to know stuff. Two, processes. Do we use 8th grade tools to do 11th grade math, or do 11th grade tools to do 11th grade math? And the last thing is really about kind of motivation, and for a lot of kids, stress management. And that's where practice test comes in. That's helping kids reframe and engage in the right way. I would say that the more anxious the kid is, the longer the runway you want to give them, because the closer it gets to the test, the more stressed they are. It is the harder it is to help them change their tools. The harder it is for them not to kind of have the brains freeze up by the impending test date.
Well, as much as we could wax lyrical all night, we also believe in the
Importance of sleep.
Yes, the importance of sleep. That's exactly where I was going with that. For those of you on the West Coast, you've got a little while, but we have less. So please do, however, feel free to give us a call, Aaron@prepmatters.com, Ned@prepmatters.com. We're more than happy to answer other questions that you've got. And feel free to send this video along to your friends and neighbors when it finds its way into your inbox.
And if you're free next, if you're interested about helping your kids make the best choices for course selection, again, our terrific and wildly entertaining colleague, Katie Dunn, will be here next Thursday. You'll probably get an email about that. Again, thanks for joining us. We hope you're helping your kids make the best decisions for them. And we hope this information was useful to you guys.
Be well.
Thanks.